Okay, if you've seen a few of my other videos on this channel, you'll know I'm not always the biggest fan of hardcore realism being injected into everything these days, especially when it involves things that are clearly a work of fantasy. Now, don't get me wrong, realism does most definitely have its place in storytelling and shouldn't be ignored, yes. But I believe it's become majorly overused these days in the name of authenticity. And honestly, I believe that one of the strongest selling points about Hollywood for many people was its willingness to mix fact and fiction as it so chose. It really helped amplify that escapist element a lot of people going to see movies wanted to experience. But the thing is, this goes back to even before Hollywood itself. If you look at quite a bit of classic literature, you'll find that authors often had no qualms about mixing truth and fantasy, or telling a story just for fun, even if they knew it wasn't accurate to real life. And today, I'd like to go over a few of these literary works to demonstrate the point that a story doesn't always need to be realistic in order to be good. But before I do, I would just like to give my usual warning that there might be spoilers ahead for both the books and any movie adaptations they might be based on. So if there's anything you plan on reading or seeing, you might just want to be on the lookout. You have been warned. Alright, so to start off simply, in this case I'm defining classic literature as any novel or short story that was written and or published before the year 1900 that is widely well known or popular. And I believe the best place to start is with the 1864 novel Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Now, as the title suggests, this book is about a group of explorers heading into the center of the Earth and all of the strange new things they encounter while down there. Now, it may surprise many to learn that the book does not in any way reflect what was believed to be below the surface of the Earth in the 1860s. In fact, Jules Verne actually has the narrator give a surprisingly accurate description of what the center of the Earth is actually like, and is continually stunned by all the strange things they encounter, chalking it up to simply isolated exceptions. In other words, Verne was actually very knowledgeable on what lies below the Earth's crust, and simply wrote the book for fun. He wasn't trying to tell a dead accurate story about what venturing inside the Earth would be like, because he knew that would be boring, and instead told a story that he knew people would enjoy. And this is perhaps even more so the case in the underrated 1959 movie adaptation. Because here, it removes the narrator's skepticism entirely and instead treats all the fascinating discoveries they make with complete sincerity. In fact, the only major changes they made were adding a woman to the expedition party, as well as a villain so the main characters could have a force to work against. But other than that, they stuck to Verne's vision of a fun fantasy adventure story first and foremost. So the point is, while not a realistic movie, it's most certainly an entertaining one, and that all around was its main goal. Verne wasn't afraid to take liberties in the name of a good story, and neither were the creators of the movie adaptation. And this applies just as much to the 1882 classic Treasure Island. In fact, Robert Louis Stevenson even begins the novel by noting that people have a real craving for pirate stories, and that's exactly what this book is going to be. Because the thing is, most of the things people associate with pirates actually come from this book. There's a reason pirates have so many legends and myths associated with them, and 90% of those myths come from the mind of Stevenson rather than real life. And this even extends to the concept of buried treasure, which is a staple of all pirate stories. But in real life, there was only ever one documented case of a pirate burying stolen treasure. Though, don't worry, you don't have to cancel your trip to the tropics or that next scuba expedition, as there's nothing to say that other pirates didn't bury their treasure, just that it wasn't a common occurrence. But the point is, just like Jules Verne, Stevenson wasn't trying to reflect real life with his novel. He was instead just trying to write the best story he could on a topic that he knew people were very interested in. And the result was perhaps the greatest and definitely most famous pirate story ever told. And it didn't need to be realistic in order to achieve any of this. And given that the 1950 movie version of the story, which is believed by many to be one of its best adaptations, stuck so closely to this, and many would say that it was better off being more fact than fiction. Even Pirates of the Caribbean arguably benefited from telling a fun story first and not being afraid to play fast and loose with history, as well as even dive headfirst into the supernatural. In other words, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that not being realistic and actively embracing fiction can sometimes be a strength of a story rather than a weakness, as these two examples beautifully show. And it really is rather telling that most classic literature did indeed reflect more on fantasy than reality. Even if you look at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the novel's full title is Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. And if you don't know what that means, the title is basically meant to tell you right off the bat that this book is much more a modern telling or reinterpretation of a Greek myth rather than anything reflective of the real world. Simply put, it wasn't meant to be realistic in any capacity. Maybe impart a few lessons, yes, but the book is not a how-to on bringing the dead back to life or Shelley trying to guess how to actually reanimate a corpse. Because in the novel, how the monster is brought back to life isn't even mentioned, only vaguely alluded to, and it's not important. It's the story of responsibility and tragedy that Shelley wants to tell here. And even though it's not realistic, it still does that job very effectively even today. And the 1931 movie adaptation similarly keeps to the spirit of this, if not much else from it. Case in point, in the movie they do show how the monster is brought to life. But that was done more for the spectacle rather than trying to add realism, and still works extremely well within the story regardless. Really? Even the works of William Shakespeare, pretty much unanimously considered the greatest writer to have ever lived, usually didn't concern himself with realism. He mixed history and fiction as much as he wanted, introduced the supernatural at the drop of a hat, and bended the rules and laws of any kind when he so needed. And the result is some of the greatest literature in human history. Because Shakespeare was telling stories on a much deeper level, concentrated on his themes, what he believed needed to be said, and revolutionizing literature with how deeply a story could be told, what it could say to people, and what it could teach them, more than most even do today. In other words, Shakespeare was a man who understood storytelling in ways most struggle to comprehend even to this day, and knew that constant realism would only lead to the detriment of his stories, not improve them. So, if I haven't made my point clear enough already, what I'm getting at here is that authors of classic literature never let an unrealistic story or story elements stop them from writing their stories the way they wanted it, and it led to some of the greatest books ever written. Heck, in some cases, they even used their plots as an excuse for what they really wanted to discuss. For example, the author of Moby Dick was more interested in talking about whales, the stars, and how sailors used them to navigate than the plot he had set up, which is a major reason why most people skip over large portions of the book these days. Or The Hunchback of Notre Dame, where the plot is just an excuse for Victor Hugo to say we need to take better care of our architecture. At one point, he dedicates literally 30 pages to describing the view from Notre Dame. The story of prejudice and tragedy is only secondary to the importance of our architecture as far as Hugo was concerned, which is why so many adaptations of the story tend to make changes so they can focus a bit more on the plot of the book presents rather than on Hugo's obsession with the cathedral. Now, as I said before, I'm not trying to say that realism is inherently a bad thing. Some of the best movies of all time are actually very realistic ones, and I'll be the first person to admit that. I'm just trying to point out that this recent hyperfixation on every last detail of every movie or story being realistic is not a healthy one. Fictional stories exist for a reason, and if they can't take advantage of the fact that they can do what we can't do in the real world anymore, well, then maybe we're losing what the whole point of telling these stories was in the first place. Okay, that's about everything I've got on that. So now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you believe that classic literature is proof that Hollywood has been going too far in their depictions of realism recently? Or do you love the direction they've been going in the past few years? Please feel free to tell me what you think in the comments. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it and I hope to see you all next time.